So we're all set. It's a long time since I was here, many years ago. It was an assembly hall when I first came to the College of the Bahamas as a lecturer in geography. They were all called lecturers then, now they're professors. Doing the same job pretty much. And this room has gone through many incarnations over the years. Nevertheless, it's nice to be here as a speaker on this occasion rather than listening to someone telling me what to do. As you can see, we've got a little talk about the history of logging in the Bahamas. I was coerced into this by the next speaker. As a geographer, and having, as I said, been coerced into this, my approach is more the land use, if you like, and changes in land use, rather than a botanic or a forestry approach. So if you'll bear with me, that's the kind of story that I'm going to tell. My view of the screen is a little bit skewed here, but if you'll bear with me, I'll try and keep up with the slides. And let's see if this works. There we go. Yes, so being not a historian and not a forester, I was a bit reliant on the various sources, and I thought I'd put them at the beginning rather than the end, because the one highlighted in yellow, let's see, Mr. Henry wrote about the pine forests of the Bahamas. He didn't actually continue till the very end of pine logging in the Bahamas, but nevertheless, he is really the key source, and the other sources are really secondary sources. We need to know where the pine forests are and what there was, and this is... And by the way, those of you who aren't familiar with the country or haven't been to the Northern Islands will have seen the pine forest when you were by the airport and perhaps driving into the hotel you're staying at. Those of you who want a closer look, I recommend you go along Gladstone Road on the way to the airport. If you can make a slight detour, get out of your transport and have a walk around. There's some very good growths there. I used to take many students there on field trips to have a look at what was going on there. So New Providence is included, but very little in the logging industry. Andros, by far, I think this is Andros here, is by far the most important. But we'll find that Grand Bahama actually has quite a lot to say in the history of logging. And this gives you the beginning of the history. We've got some dates here. The Abaco Lumber Company was established. It had a different name to start with in 1900, and logging pretty much began in 1905. And it worked through Abaco, kind of from north to south. They established a sawmill at what they call Wilson City, which was a kind of a glorified lumber camp. But nevertheless, as you'll see, it had some character. And the pine forests, which are also worth looking at, these maps from Mr. Henry show, in all the cases I show you a map, the black is where obviously the forest is. Norman's Castle's where there was quite a lot of logging done, and there was a sawmill there. The main one was at Wilson City. For reference, Marsh Harbor's there, Cherokee here, so it's sort of in that general area. And eventually, they worked their way all the way down to the south. A lot of the lumber, they were cutting it for lumber, was exported to Cuba. And it apparently, I'm not 100% certain on this, they brought back horses from Cuba. I think this has been genetically proven. And these horses roamed around for many years, certainly while I've been here. But I understand that more recently, they've now all died out. I just slipped that in at the last minute, as I thought it might be of some interest, as we've got such a mixture of people at this conference. But this is what Wilson City was like, with or without the horses. And you can see what they're actually producing. Cut lumber. This was the accommodation. In all these operations, they laid track They called them railways. They had engines, and basically wherever they were cutting the lumber, they transported it to the sawmill, and then from the sawmill to the dock for export. None of it was really used here at all. This was the kind of production that went on. This is in cubic meters. I should add that the lumber industry, or really the whole forestry industry, has quite esoteric range of measures, of which the cord, those of you from the north and buy cords of firewood will probably be familiar with it, is widely used. The trouble with the cord is it varies if you're cutting lumber or if you're cutting timber for pulp. It's a different size. If you buy it in Maine, it's going to be one thing, and in Texas it'll be somewhere else, and in Germany it'll be something else again. And then they have the board foot and the hopper's foot and the hopper's cube and a thing called a steer. So to simplify things, I, and with the help of Mr. Henry, reduced everything to cubic meters, because of course you're all familiar with cubic meters. And the point here is the average, which is, well, let's say it's around 15,000. You can see Abaco was important. Then we had a slump during the war years. Then it moved over to Grand Bahama, and finally to Andros, and production ended about 1967 of the sawn lumber. Try and remember this 15,000 figure, because when we move on to the later operations, you'll see that there's quite a change in scale, despite the fact the histograms are going to look a little bit similar. In Grand Bahama, operations started after the war, very much to do with Wallace Groves, generally considered the founder of Freeport, but he started really in the lumber industry, and the pine yards were at Pine Ridge, which is basically, the name is still used in the electoral districts, and is essentially where Freeport is today. Again, you can see that the idea of the track being laid and the engines used to haul the timber. Initially, everything was exported from the north coast. The road, or the track road, still exists. It was taken out by barge to deeper water, and then it was exported. Later on, they moved to the south, and incipient Freeport Harbor down here is where they established a lumber yard, which is kind of just a mess of lumber lying everywhere, and a sawmill. And you can see the kind of material. Unfortunately, these are old pictures taken from various texts, so the quality is a little bit limited. But you get the general idea. Wallace Groves wasn't content to just carry on what they were doing in Abaco after he bought the Abaco Lumber Company, but he looked for other opportunities, and after the war, as coal mining increased considerably in Great Britain and Germany, he got a contract to supply pit props. Now, this was actually a major change in the whole logging industry, because up until then, as they were producing sawn timber, the girth of the trees had to be 8 inches or greater. Once you're doing pit props, it really didn't matter what the girth was, so this sort of size restriction disappeared. And starting in Grand Bahama, they were cutting down much smaller trees. In fact, just 4 inches would have been sufficient. The pit props didn't have to be sawn. They could be used as they were, as round logs, to support the mine tunnels. Obviously, there was a great expansion in the areas and the amount of timber that they could cut. So this really was a precursor to what was coming next. Because Wallace Groves, the pit prop game didn't last forever. He got in touch with what we now know as Owens, Illinois, which is a huge container company, and one of the containers was brown paper bags, which they call kraft paper, which is made from pulp. And it's made from pulp of pine trees, which we have quite a lot of. And as a result, Wallace Groves signed a contract with these to cut the pine forests for pulp. And the details are pretty much there. They worked through Grand Bahama, but they soon finished off with Grand Bahama. Pit props and the early pulp took care of that, and so they were done by 1955. And then they moved over to Andros. Again, you can see the distribution of material there. Now, there was still logging for lumber in Andros, and you get some idea of what the setup was there for the lumber. But this also ended in 1967. Stafford Creek was the main, it's just up here somewhere, was the main center where they had a lumber mill, and they exported the lumber from there. But very quickly, they moved on to producing pulp. This was soon to change, is the point here. I have to keep moving. So that kind of summarizes what that was about. And as before, Abaco became the center of operations initially. And this is the kind of production that was undertaken. You can see Abaco here, and then they went back to Andros. A little bit in Grand Bahama at the beginning. Look at the average, around about 300,000 cubic meters. 15,000 is about here. This is when they were cutting for lumber. So you can see the scale changed enormously, and why I made the point about Wallace Groves having such a considerable impact on the environment of these northern islands over really three-quarters of a century, from the virtually the beginning of the 20th century till the mid-1970s. The reason this stops here is because this is where Henry's book ends, so he didn't have any later information. I'll get back to that before we finish. Then they went on and finished cutting. By this time, as I mentioned, with the horses were replaced with mechanization. The logging in Andros was replaced from hand sawn to tractors and the bow saw. We'll see a little bit more of that. And so the whole thing was getting more and more mechanized. The pulp was shipped out to Jacksonville, Florida, where the pulp mill was established, and they made the paper. This is where there was quite a large impact on the landscape, not to neglect what was going on in the other two islands, but Andros, I guess, was less active and less widely settled and had poorer communications than the other two islands. Grand Bahama had poor communications, but it was concentrated all around where we currently have Freeport. So nothing much really happened to spread things out in Grand Bahama. In Abaco, looking at the land use and the subsequent impact of forestry on the island, you can see that from Norman's Castle down past Marsh Harbor, Wilson City, and on down to Sandy Point, they did put in a road, a central road, and this was the first time that really there was inland communication throughout Abaco. Now, a similar thing happened on a rather wider scale, because it's a much bigger island, in Eleuthera, or strictly speaking, the northern Andros, not Eleuthera, Andros. And they divided up the land from Lot 1, which is up here by Red Bays, and worked the way down. I can't quite read all this. I think that's Owens town, named after the company that owned the operation. The old sawmill at Stafford Creek was actually used to construct housing and material, and for the new operations. Then it was dismantled and sold. So that part of the operation disappeared. But Owens, Illinois had an airfield down here. They established themselves a port up at Morgan's Bluff, which is still there and was in use for many years as a water barging port for water that was barged from Andros to New Providence. Some of this is described here. At this time, Nicholstown became like the administrative center, very much like Marsh Harbor did in Abaco because of the pulp mill operations. You can see that things are a bit cleaner now. We've got more mechanization. The roads aren't so ragged. They're nicely laid out, straight. The fill to raise them from the ditch on the right in this picture. Mechanized log cutters and transporters did a lot of the material. As the pulp was only exported as logs, it didn't have to be sawn into boards or anything else. They just chopped the logs up, and you get some idea what's happening there. There's the bow saw in use again. They also used what they call slash cutters, which chopped them up even more. I think the length was somewhere around 6 feet. Maybe Mr. Russell can advise us on that. And this is a collecting point. But that was all they had to do to get them onto the boat. There's some logs ready for shipment. Billets are another measure that they used in the industry. This is a boat at Morgan's Bluff. It's not quite clear what it is, but this is the ramp, the forklift carrying the billets of logwood, and the whole lot goes off to Jacksonville. I mentioned that Henry's information didn't continue, but from other sources it became clear that the final years of the production in Andros was at a very high level, some probably around 400,000 cubic meters a year. So I extended my earlier graph out here to give you some idea of what it would look like if we'd had the exact data. It's approximate data, but I have no reason to believe that it didn't end up like that. And then everything ended. Owens, Illinois pulled out. They'd taken all the best lumber, and looks like I'm on schedule. And although they didn't quite abandon the Bahamas, you'll see here, and some of you will be aware, that in Abaco they cleared some 50,000 acres and attempted to do a sugarcane plantation there. But it failed after a couple of years. I'm advisedly informed that the key thing was the lack of rainfall, particularly in the growing season, which would be very much in the winter season. As you know, we have a wet, dry season, rainfall seasons here. So unfortunately that failed. But some of the land is now used for other agricultural projects. Essentially, I wanted to finish off by saying, well, what was the impact of all of this? Sure, the country got a lot of money, and there was a lot of employment for these operations over a period of about 75 years. What was left? You may have seen on one of the slides that at the end, as they weren't selecting trees, they were just cutting everything in sight, because if you were pulping it up, it didn't really matter what size it was. They left 5 seed trees, mature trees, per acre. The forests we have today are from those 5 trees per acre on all the islands. I guess it hasn't been totally unsuccessful, but the next speaker will say something about that. There are issues with managing the forests, as you can see. Hurricanes, as on Grand Bahama, strip and poison with seawater incursion. The lands that get flooded, you also get fires. We have them here in New Providence as well. The first pictures I got were in New Providence of a fire. I was quite taken by the picture off Carmichael Road, I think it was. It was in Grand Bahama. But there is a modern era now of which the forests are being introduced for a variety of impacts. Other things that were given to the Bahamas as a result of the industry were the roads. This one is still in use to Water Key, which is a resort off the shore of Grand Bahama. And those of you who work on Andros know that those logging roads are your sort of infrastructure of choice. Only recently was the road to, recently I say, in the last maybe 10 years ago, the road to Red Bays was actually surfaced. Before that, it was essentially the old logging road. There's my sources again. Thank you very much.